standing on by from New Scientist magazine. Good morning to you, Janine.
Good morning, Wemo.
Good morning. And today, first up, we're talking about weight loss or putting on weight, medicines that, in fact, make you fat.
This is potentially another very, very good reason to avoid antibiotics as much as you possibly can for as long as you possibly can. Most people would know about antibiotic resistance and the major problems that that's starting to cause. There's a story in our issue this week that's talking about particular bacteria that are able to just sit and wait until the antibiotics go away, which means you actually have a persistent infection instead of one that's resistant. Separate story. This one is talking about the fact that antibiotics might be changing our gut bacteria so much, and we've talked about gut bacteria a few times in the last year or so, but I see this as a recurring theme through our program. I think it's fine. But changing our gut bacteria to the extent that it could be causing us to gain weight, and it could be contributing to the vast amount of obesity that's going on around the world. In the last 70 years, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of antibiotics and the volume that they're being taken in, and a lot of indiscriminate use. People who take antibiotics for colds, it's not going to work. It doesn't work that way. They're not bacterial infections. So all this misuse and a lack of targeted use has meant that antibiotic resistance and other issues have started popping up over the last 20, 30 years. This is a new one. Researchers took mice, as you tend to do when you're looking at these sorts of things, because mice are a reasonable model for humans. They started giving them low doses of antibiotics from birth, basically, and they were trying to mimic the conditions that farm animals are under. And they found that within 30 weeks, so that's a bit over 4 months, they were 10 to 15% larger than control animals that hadn't received any at all.
Huh.
And they found that there was a different population of bugs in their guts. More importantly, perhaps, there was a really significant reduction of one of the good bacteria called lactobacillus. And it was scariest that the biggest mice were the ones that were given antibiotics from birth, even pulsed antibiotics. So you give them high doses every now and then, like some of us do when we have infections. Even those animals were larger than those who hadn't received any at all.
Interesting. Okay, so lay off the antibiotics. So I think doctors and GPs are prescribing antibiotics less than they used to. Do you think?
I do, yeah. The education campaigns and some scaremongering, let's be honest, it goes on in all sorts of different areas, have been very good in letting people know that you don't take antibiotics indiscriminately. An interesting study that was alongside this one, researchers were looking at feces, so poo, that was anything between 1,600 and 3,000 years old. How do you look at 3,000-year-old poo, you ask?
Yeah.
Well, you actually look at the DNA footprints that they leave behind. The bacteria that were in our poo 3,000 years ago are completely different from what we have now. And there's questions about whether or not we should be going and hoovering up poo from less developed countries than the ones we live in, and finding ways to be able to transfer them back into our systems to kind of reboot them, if you like, back to what they should be, to what they used to be. It's an interesting idea, but hey, if you can do poo transplants, then why can't you do bacterial poo transplants?
Indeed, that's true. We've talked about something like that before.
We have.
On to now a story about the effect of climate change on orcas.
Yeah, this one is actually really interesting. Hudson Bay is in the eastern part of Canada, and for most of the year it actually has sea ice covering not only the bay but also the Hudson Strait, which is the narrow opening that leads into it. Summer sea ice has been declining there for the last 40 or so years, and it's been around about 16% in the Strait and about 11 or so percent per decade in the bay itself. Sightings of orcas, so killer whales, have increased dramatically in the last 40 or so years. So it means that something has changed. Before 1900, there were no, and they've been reporting since the 1600s, no reports of orcas in Hudson Bay.
Wow.
And it seems to be reasonably clear now, because the summer sea ice is decreasing, the orcas have worked out that if they come into the bay, then they've got rich pickings of narwhals, bowheads, and beluga whales. So you have a very interesting situation where you have one endangered species, the orca, going after other endangered species. It's actually a really interesting situation because no one would have considered predation on these animals as a side effect of climate change. The belugas are probably among the most endangered. Certainly in the Eastern Bay, they're very endangered. They're not so bad on the western side. The bowheads have been recovering from commercial whaling, but they're also under threat. There's only 5,000 narwhals left, though. So that's probably the biggest concern that they have, because killer whales are called that for a reason. They hunt. They're very creative killers. They're able to generate waves to knock seals off rocks, for example. They ram their prey, and the only protection that these poor prey animals have is to hide in relatively shallow water. And one of the researchers is quoted as saying that if these animals could walk on land to get away from these orcas, they would.
Right.
They're that scared of them. So this is a big change to their habitat, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. The thought is that it's likely not to cause serious problems in the short term, because because you see a lot of tail fins doesn't mean that there's necessarily a lot of them. No one's sure of the actual numbers. But either way, it's a massive change to the habitat and the way the prey-predator system is actually working.
Just shows that before we went around upsetting the ecosystem, everything was in a fine balance. You know, that species had worked out where they should be and where they were safe. And as climate change gets worse, you're just going to get species migrating on land and in water into places where they're going to come in conflict more and more often.
Absolutely. There are also other issues of overfishing and the like. I've forgotten exactly where it is, but there's a species of squid that's taken over one body of water because all the sharks have been taken out. There's only a handful of them left in this particular area. So squid, being the intelligent and creative and vicious hunters that they are, have bred to extreme numbers, and they're likely not ever to be able to be removed, and they're vicious. It's scary, the numbers that there are. So it's not just climate change, it's a combination of everything else that we're doing. As you say, it was a fine balance, and it's largely tipped out, unfortunately.
Indeed. Well, those two stories you'll find in the next New Scientist magazine and also newscientist.com. Janine, thanks very much.
See you next week.